Stand in the middle of your camp and count. There are 30 of you. That is a normal size for a group of hunter-gatherers. Now look for somebody to marry. Roughly half are the wrong age, in one direction or the other. Of the ones who are left, most of your parents, your brothers and sisters, your children, your aunts and uncles, your cousins. Count who is actually available. Very often, the answer is nobody. So the first fact about marriage in a small society is not romance, and it is not culture. It is arithmetic. A band of 30 people cannot supply its own partners. Not this generation, and certainly not the next. Which means every group has to be permanently plugged into other groups, or it disappears in about 2 generations. That is the problem this episode is about, and the solutions people found are stranger than you would guess. Start with the one rule that turns up everywhere. Every human society we know of has rules about who you may not marry. The categories vary enormously. Some societies forbid a whole clan of thousands. Some let you marry a first cousin. Some insist you marry a particular cousin. But the existence of the rule does not vary. There is always a list. And in many societies, the rule does not stop at forbidding. It tells you exactly who you ought to marry. Cross-cousin systems are the classic case. Your ideal partner is your mother's brother's child or your father's sister's child, and the same pairing repeats every generation. That is not a restriction with a gap left in it. It is an instruction, and it locks 2 families into a relationship that renews itself. Sigmund Freud had an explanation, and it is the one most people still carry around. His assumption was that a thing has to be forbidden because people want to do it. The evidence points almost exactly the other way. In 1891, the Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermarck proposed the opposite. Children raised in close daily contact during the first few years of life develop a sexual indifference to each other automatically without being taught. On that view, the taboo is not fighting an urge. It is putting a name to something the body has already decided, which sounds untestable, except that history ran 2 enormous accidental experiments. The first is the Israeli kibbutz. Children were raised communally, in peer groups, sleeping and eating together from infancy, unrelated to each other. Joseph Shepard went through thousands of marriages from those cohorts. The number of marriages between 2 people who had been in the same peer group before the age of 6 was, to a first approximation, 0. Not forbidden. Nobody had banned it. It simply did not happen. The second is a Taiwanese marriage custom studied by Arthur Wolfe across household registers covering many thousands of couples. In a minor marriage, a family adopted an infant girl and raised her alongside the son she would eventually marry. Those marriages had measurably lower fertility, more divorce, more adultery, and more open resistance than ordinary marriages in the same villages. Both datasets have been re-examined and argued over, and the size of the effect is genuinely contested. But the direction has held up, and it tells you what the trigger actually is. It is not blood. It is proximity in early childhood, which is exactly why the rules do not line up with genetics. Societies routinely forbid marrying somebody with no shared ancestry at all, like a step-sibling or a member of your clan. And they routinely permit first cousins, which much of the world does today. There's a real biological cost to close pairings. Everybody carries broken copies of genes, and relatives carry the same broken copies. But the effect for cousins is modest, and evolution does not need us to understand the reason for a behavior that works. So the incest taboo cannot be simply a rule about damaged genes, because it forbids the wrong people and permits the right ones. It is doing some other job. Hold that thought, because the archaeology is about to hand us the answer. Now the harder question. Can you actually see any of this in the ground? For most of the history of the subject, no. A skeleton gives you age and sex, and beyond that you're guessing about who anybody was to anybody. 2 techniques changed that, and they're independent of each other, which is what makes the combination powerful. The first is chemistry. The strontium in your teeth comes from the rock under the food you ate as a child. So a tooth records the geology of where you grew up, and a skeleton buried somewhere with different geology has moved. In the trade episode, we used that to separate objects that traveled from people who traveled. The second is ancient DNA, which now gets you not just ancestry, but relatedness, person to person, in a single cemetery. And there is one particularly neat trick inside it. If your parents were related to each other, you inherit long stretches of chromosome that are identical on both sides. The longer those stretches, the closer the relationship. So a single genome quietly reports on the marriage that produced it. It is an unusually direct kind of evidence. Nobody has to interpret a pot or guess at a symbol. The chromosome is a receipt, which lets us ask the question about a species that is no longer here. Deep in Denisova cave in the Altai mountains of Siberia, a Neanderthal toe bone produced a very high-quality genome. When K. Proofer and colleagues published it in 2014, it carried unusually long, identical stretches. Her parents were about as closely related as half-siblings or an uncle and a niece. One genome is an anecdote, but Neanderthal genomes in general show low diversity and small populations. And then, in 2022, we finally got a whole community instead of individuals. Chagyrskaya cave, also in the Altai, excavated over years, with a team led by Loritz Skov and Benjamin Peter publishing 13 individuals. They lived at the same time. This is not a palimpsest of visitors. It is a group. Among them, a father and his teenage daughter, a boy and an adult female relative, perhaps a cousin or an aunt. The estimated effective population size of that community is around 20. Now the clever part. Compare the diversity of what you inherit only from your mother with what you inherit only from your father. At Chagyrskaya, the maternal line is far more varied than the paternal line. That is the signature of women joining the group from outside, while men stayed where they were born. Their estimate is that most of the movement into that community, possibly all of it, was female. So Neanderthals were not sitting in a cave marrying their sisters. They had exogamy, and they practiced it. The problem was not the rule. The problem was that there was almost nobody to reach. A group of 20, in a landscape of other groups of 20, spread very thin, is running the right policy against impossible arithmetic. And the most extreme case of marrying out that anybody has ever found comes from the same cave system. A single fragment of bone from Denisova, sequenced by Vivian Slon and colleagues in 2018, belonged to a girl of about 13. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, a different human population entirely. Not a distant echo of ancient interbreeding. A first-generation child, with one parent from each group. And that came out of a few dozen bone fragments from one cave, which suggests such meetings were not as rare as they sound. Now, put a modern human community from roughly the same era next to it. Sunghir, in Russia, which this series has been to 3 times already, for its graves, its ivory beads, and its buried children. This time we are looking at the genomes, published by Martin Sikora and colleagues in 2017. For individuals, buried together with extraordinary care, about 34,000 years ago. The obvious expectation is a family, a father and his sons, perhaps. That is not what came back. None of them were close relatives. No closer than second cousins, in a grave where 2 children were laid head to head under thousands of beads. And the genomes carry very little of that long, identical stretching, which means their parents were not closely related either. Run the numbers back, and you get a mating network of perhaps a few hundred people at a time when any one camp held a few dozen. Which means that 34,000 years ago, in a cold and nearly empty landscape, people were systematically finding partners far outside the group they lived with. And all that ornament starts to look less like decoration and more like equipment. In the trade episode, we argued that beads may work as something readable at a distance, a way of being recognized by strangers. If you have to marry outside, you need a way of arriving somewhere as a known quantity. Move forward 25,000 years, and the resolution gets absurd. At Hazleton North in the Cotswolds in England, a stone tomb was built about 5,700 years ago and used for a few generations. In 2021, a team led by Chris Fowler and Inigo Alalde sequenced 35 people from it. And they reconstructed the oldest family tree anybody has ever recovered. 5 generations of it. 27 of the people descend from one man, who had children with 4 different women. The tomb has 2 chambers, north and south. The descendants of 2 of those women are in one chamber, the descendants of the other 2 are in the other. Which means the architecture of the building is a diagram of the family. You are buried in the branch you belong to. Sons are there with their fathers. Adult daughters are almost entirely missing, which is what you see when women leave to marry elsewhere. But the detail that matters most is easy to skip past. Several men in that tomb are the sons of women in the lineage by fathers from outside it. Their biological father is not in the family. They're in the tomb anyway, placed with their mother's line, treated exactly like everybody else. The people who built that monument knew who was whose child. They had the information. They made a different decision. And this is not one odd site. In 2023, Maite Rivalet and colleagues published a cemetery at Gurgy in France. About 100 individuals and a pedigree 7 generations deep. The pattern is consistent. Descent traced through fathers, women arriving from outside, brothers staying. Almost no half-siblings, which suggests fairly stable pairings. And essentially no unions between close relatives, held to for centuries in a society with no writing and no register office. Which brings us to the twist, and it is a change of sign. Every account of the incest taboo treats it as a prohibition, a list of people you cannot have. Turn it over. A rule that forbids everybody nearby is a rule that forces you to go and get somebody far away. It does not mainly restrict who you marry. It compels you to make a connection outside your group every single generation, whether you feel like it or not. The anthropologist we met last episode in the houses at Cattlehook, Claude Levi-Strauss, built his work on kinship around exactly this idea. His word for it was alliance. The point of the rule is not the marriage. It is the tie between two groups that the marriage creates. That framing has been criticized hard, not least for describing women as the thing being exchanged rather than as people doing the exchanging, and the criticism is fair. But the observation underneath it survives. A system that forces partners to come from outside is a system that manufactures allies. And look at what each of those marriages actually builds. It puts a household in another valley that has a permanent, personal reason to care whether you get through the winter. It creates somewhere to go when your own place fails and somebody obliged to take you in. In the trade episode, we met the Johansi exchange partnerships that keep a person's right to arrive at a distant waterhole alive. Marriage is that, with the strongest possible glue, children who belong to both ends of the line. So the cost of exogamy, which is losing a daughter or a son to another camp, is not really a cost. It is the premium on an insurance policy. Now set the two genomic pictures side by side one last time. Neanderthals at Chagyrskaya. The right rule. Women moving between groups and an effective population of about 20. Modern humans at Sunghir. The same rule and a mating network in the hundreds. The difference is not obviously in the rules or in anybody's intelligence. It is in the size of the web the rules could reach. And a bigger web is not simply more babies. It is more people who owe you something. More places you're allowed to walk into. More routes for anything anybody has worked out about stone or plants or weather. It has to be said plainly that this is a hypothesis and not a demonstrated cause. The Neanderthal samples come from a handful of caves, and a handful of caves cannot speak for a whole species across 4 continents and hundreds of thousands of years. But it does reframe what the taboo is for. It is not a fence around the family. It is a pump that pushes people outward, and the network is what comes back. Which leaves the last word to those stepsons at Hazleton. Somebody carried them into that tomb and laid them with their mother's line, in the chamber that belonged to her. Everyone present knew the biology. The building says something else. Kinship is not a fact you discover in a person. It is a decision people keep making about each other. And occasionally they make it so firmly that they build the answer out of stone, and it is still there 5,000 years later, waiting to be misread.